All right, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep, like really deep, into the world of Julius Evola.
Deep is right.
Yeah, this guy, often called a radical traditionalist, wrote this fascinating book, Men Among the Ruins, right after World War II. And it's dense, it's provocative,
Definitely thought-provoking.
and it's sometimes, well, pretty challenging to unpack.
Yeah.
But, our listeners, they're smart, curious, they want to understand these complex ideas, and they want to do it, efficiently without wading through tons of background.
Yeah. Right to the good stuff.
Exactly. So today's mission, if you choose to accept it, is to extract the core, the essence of Evola's thinking about the state, society, tradition, all in the context of that, shattered post-war landscape. And right off the bat, you see this symbol on the cover of the book, a Norse Valknut. Evola specifically chose that. And it represents, for him, the forgotten traditions, the spiritual values that he felt, I guess, modern materialism had kind of buried. So think of that as our first clue, right, into what we're dealing with here.
It's a good starting point. Yeah, a hint of the kind of themes he's going to be grappling with throughout the book. And that's exactly what this deep dive is designed to do, to give you a really solid grasp of Evola's central arguments. And we're going straight to the source material for this one.
Yeah, straight to the source. And, whether you've read Evola before or maybe this is your first encounter with his work, stick with us. We're going to break down, the most crucial and maybe even some of the most surprising insights from this guy.
And the way he analyzed this, incredibly pivotal historical moment.
Okay, so let's just jump right into it. Right off the bat, you stumble upon this sort of contradiction, right?
Yeah.
Evola, this traditionalist, deeply invested in, well, tradition. How does that square with his involvement with fascism, with National Socialism?
Yeah, that's a fascinating paradox. It's easy to just see it as a simple alignment, like,
Right.
oh, traditionalist authoritarian movements must be a natural fit.
Right, right.
But some research suggests that Mussolini's interest in Evola was more strategic, right? Like he was trying to build those connections with Germany, understand them better. But when you look at Evola's motivations, they're described as eschatological. It's this focus on ultimate realities, metaphysical stuff, not so much immediate political maneuvering.
So not necessarily this kind of like shared ideology all the way down, right?
No, not at all. I mean, we know that, for example, Evola actually applied to join the Fascist Party in 1939.
Really?
Yeah, hoping to be an officer in the war like he was in World War I. And to do that, well, you had to be a party member. But get this, his application was rejected.
Rejected.
Why? Two main reasons. First, he'd criticized fascism in his writing, as a journalist earlier on, so they were like, is he really committed?
That makes sense, I guess.
And second, he had a military demotion on his record from 1934.
A demotion. What happened there?
So Evola, he refused to duel a reporter. I know, right? Apparently dueling was still, like, a thing for ex-officers to settle disputes.
Oh, wow.
But Evola, he called this reporter an authentic gangster.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, his words. And he basically said, look, I'm not going to give this guy the honor of a duel. We're not on the same level. That refusal, well, it landed him in military court and boom, demotion.
It really shows, though, doesn't it? This unwillingness to compromise.
Oh, absolutely. He had his code and he stuck to it, even if it cost him.
Okay, so that's fascism.
Yeah.
What about his view of National Socialism? I mean, was he on board with the Nazis?
Well, this is really interesting. Recent research shows he was even more critical of National Socialism than we previously thought, especially Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi ideologue. But there's this other layer to this, right? Evola was very close with Edgar Julius Jung, private secretary to the German Chancellor Franz von Papen.
Oh.
And Jung was a fascinating figure himself. He was a big proponent of the Ordensstaat, which is basically a state structured around orders or estates, like those hierarchical societies you saw in the medieval period.
Right, I get that.
And they were reportedly planning, Evola and Jung, to create this Ghibelline front to basically push back against those more radical, excessive aspects of Nazism.
Wow. So like an internal resistance almost?
Yeah, in a way. And this is where it gets pretty intense. According to Leopold Ziegler, a traditionalist philosopher, Jung was even planning to assassinate Hitler.
Oh, wow.
But sadly, in 1934, Jung himself was murdered by the Nazis.
So Evola is right in the thick of this really volatile, ideologically charged environment.
Yeah, surrounded by danger, by political intrigue. It's a fascinating period to examine.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's dig into Evola's concept of the path of conviction.
Yeah.
And also this idea of autarky. It's very central to his thinking, right?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, what really strikes me about Evola is how deeply personal his philosophy is. Like the path of conviction, he describes it as this solitary journey. Self-reliance is everything. It's like he's saying, you're on your own, buddy. You can only count on yourself.
Very stoic.
Yeah, definitely has that element. And he doesn't offer these easy answers, prepackaged paths, nothing like that. Each person has to forge their own path, driven by their own internal suffering, by their own needs. And he really warns against just passively accepting, pre-digested ideas from outside sources.
It's like he's saying, think for yourself.
Precisely. Think for yourself, suffer for yourself, create your own path. That's the essence of it.
Okay, so how does this connect to his principle of autarky?
Well, this idea of the solitary, self-sufficient individual, right? That really flows into his understanding of autarky. He encountered this idea in various mystical and esoteric traditions, but he gives it this strong philosophical foundation through the path of conviction. It really leads to what scholars have called the authoritative self in his work. It's all about inner strength, independence of thought.
Interesting. Now, there's another thinker who clearly had a huge influence on Evola, Otto Weininger.
Oh yeah, Weininger. His work really resonated with Evola. You can see echoes of Weininger's focus on truthfulness throughout Evola's writing. Like Weininger has this powerful line, truth, purity, loyalty, uprightness toward oneself. These are the only imaginable ethics.
Wow, pretty strong statement.
Right, and Evola was definitely drawn to that. And then there's this epigram from Hebel that Weininger includes, which just drives the point home. Which do you pay for more dearly, the lie or the truth? The first you pay with yourself, the second, at worst, with your happiness.
That's a stark choice.
It is. It's like, are you willing to sacrifice your very being for a lie or risk temporary unhappiness for truth?
It's interesting how that connects to Evola's path of conviction, finding truth through suffering, forging your own way.
Definitely. They both emphasize this inner struggle, the difficult path towards a higher self. And there's this other element of Weiner's philosophy that really resonated with Evola, this profound sense of the individual's cosmic isolation, right? And their inherent inner law. Weiner writes, man is alone in the cosmos, in eternal immense loneliness. He has no purpose except himself. He is alone, but only now is he one and all, and that is why he has a law within himself. That is why he is all law. Powerful stuff.
And he goes on, right? And he demands from himself that he follow this law within himself. Nothing stands above him, the alone, the all one. But he must comply with the pitiless categorical imperative within, which tolerates no negotiations with itself. He calls for salvation. I mean, this is heavy stuff.
It is, and it speaks to that same focus on inner strength, on self-reliance that we see in Evola's emphasis on the individual's spiritual journey.
Okay, let's talk about another really interesting aspect of Evola's thinking, contemplation, and specifically what he calls the self-event.
Right. So Evola is exploring this specific kind of contemplation, sensual contemplation, he calls it, that he believes arises from a state of true freedom. And he distinguishes this from, just our everyday sensory experiences. It's something you access when you're free internally, not overwhelmed by the external world.
And in this state, what happens?
Well, Evola says, time and duration melts away. Pure, absolute eternity is within us.
That's a pretty profound idea. So time ceases to exist in this state of contemplation.
Exactly. It dissolves. You're experiencing pure eternity, which, according to Evola, is actually within us all along.
Okay, and how does the self-event fit into this? What is that?
So Evola says that the self-event is the root of all worldviews. So it's this fundamental internal experience, right? Self, freed from time, and it becomes the very foundation for how we understand reality.
Fascinating. All right, now we need to tread carefully here because we're getting into Evola's interpretation of Jewishness. And this is something that's generated, understandably, a lot of debate, a lot of controversy.
Absolutely. It's crucial to understand that Evola has a very specific definition here, right? He's not talking about race in a biological sense, or a people, or even a legally defined profession.
Okay, so what is he talking about then?
He calls Jewishness a spiritual attitude, a certain psychic constitution. And he says that historically this found its most grandiose realization in historical Jewry. But, and this is important, he says it's an opportunity for all men. So it's this abstract concept for him.
Okay, that's a very different way of of framing it. But then how does he explain, the existence of anti-Semitism if it's not about race or peoplehood for him?
Yeah, this is where things get really paradoxical. He says, the truest, most Aryan of Aryans are no anti-Semites. But then he says, on the other hand, one can always detect certain Jewish traits in the aggressive anti-Semites. It's almost like a psychological analysis. He's saying you hate in others what you yourself struggle with internally.
Like, you can't truly hate something unless there's some part of you that recognizes it, maybe even identifies with it.
That's how he sees it. It's like if you have absolutely nothing in common with something, you can't hate it with that kind of intensity.
So when Evola says Jew, what does he really mean?
He's very clear about that. He's talking about man in general, as far as he shares the Platonic idea of Jewishness, and he wants to define that idea, that spiritual and psychic constitution that he sees as a potential within all people.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Another really important concept for Evola is action without attachment, and also his concept of eternity. How do these fit together?
Well, to illustrate this, Evola quotes Meister Eckhart. Eckhart writes, "Coarse-natured people must simply believe this, but the enlightened must know it."
Interesting quote.
Right. So there are different levels of understanding, different ways of approaching truth. And on the topic of action, Evola again quotes Eckhart, who says he is just who gives everybody what is due to him. But Evola offers another interpretation. Quote, "Those are just who take all things from God to be equal, whatever it may be, great or small, dear or not, completely the same, without less or more, the one like the other." And that requires, according to Evola, a real detachment from the world, and crucially, from self-love.
Detachment from self-love. That's pretty challenging.
Yeah.
And how does this connect to his understanding of eternity?
For Evola, eternity isn't just, infinite time. It's the atemporal, the realm beyond time. Past and future merge into this absolute present. And it's in this timeless realm that tradition, as Evola understands it, operates. It's the most intrinsic of all being, he says. It's not about, nostalgia, looking backwards. It's about tapping into something timeless.
And Evola draws heavily on Stoic philosophy and also Eastern philosophies like the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, for sure. He includes excerpts from Lao Tzu as interpreted by Suzuki. He highlights, the equal suffering inherent in both honor and disgrace, and also the sage's inner security, that freedom from temptation, contrasted with the vulnerability of those who are attached to external things. It's that stoic resilience.
Right. And the Bhagavad Gita, that's a text he really delves into. Specifically, he's fascinated by Arjuna's, agonizing dilemma on the battlefield.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Arjuna, facing the prospect of killing his own kin, he's just overwhelmed by despair. It's visceral, right? He says, "My limbs sink down, and my mouth dries up, and my body trembles." He can't even hold his bow. He begs Krishna to release him from his duty as a warrior, but Krishna's like, "No, thou hast mourned the not to be mourned, and yet thou speakest as if with wisdom. For the dead and for the not dead, the Pandits, wise ones, do not mourn."
So Krishna is essentially telling Arjuna that, death is an illusion, the soul is eternal, there's no need to grieve.
Right. He's emphasizing this detachment from outcome, and he urges Arjuna to therefore fight heroically, descendant of Bharata. It's about duty, about accepting your role, regardless of the emotional cost.
And how did Evola interpret this pivotal scene?
Well, for Evola, he saw it as this powerful metaphor. Arjuna's outward battle, right? It's a symbol of the inner struggle for self-mastery, for liberation. And he connects this to other traditions too, like the Quran, the Bible's concept of the greater and the lesser holy war. The external conflict always mirrors that internal one.
Yeah, let's circle back to Evola's interactions with fascism.
Yeah.
Because, we talked about his initial hopes, his eventual disillusionment. There's more to uncover there, right?
Yeah, there's this anecdote about Regini, this esoteric thinker. He attacked Mussolini in his journal, Atenor, for not being anti-Christian enough.
Wow. Bold move.
Yeah. And get this, Mussolini actually responded to him in detail under a pseudonym.
So Mussolini is engaging with these esoteric debates.
It seems so.
Okay.
And then there's the UR group, led by Evola. They were doing these specific rites, trying to, I guess, infuse fascism with the spirit of ancient Rome.
Interesting. So a very specific kind of esoteric fascism.
Yeah. And Mussolini was supposedly quite surprised by this. But the Catholic Church, they weren't messing around. The future Pope Paul VI, he condemned Evola's, quote, magicians and their fanatical re-evocations.
That's pretty intense. It really shows this clash, right?
Yeah.
Between these different strands within early fascism,
Mm.
modernism, like futurism, and then these traditionalist influences.
Yeah. A lot of internal tension, a lot of competing ideas swirling around.
And speaking of competing ideas,
Yeah.
Evola's early political essay, the one he wrote for his friend Colonna di Cesare, who's a Democrat. Pretty telling, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He was writing for a democratic publication, and yet he delivers this scathing critique of democracy itself. And what's really surprising is that he also portrays fascism as this kind of this mere caricature.
A caricature.
Yeah, he said it lacked real spiritual and cultural foundations. He even compared fascism to a newly rich man who's trying to buy education and refinement after he's already achieved material success.
So a very early critique of fascism,
Mm-hmm.
and one that's rooted in this idea that it lacks that deeper spiritual essence.
Exactly. And this really highlights how consistent Evola is, right? He's always focused on those deeper roots that he believes are essential for any legitimate political order.
Okay, and it's important to note that, beyond the politics and the philosophy, Evola was also involved in all sorts of intellectual pursuits.
Oh yeah, he was a very wide-ranging thinker. His journal, Diorama, is a testament to that. It had poetry by Proust, Joyce, Mann, critiques of Freud, Jung, Nietzsche, Bachofen, Bergson. I mean, the list goes on.
So a real intellectual melting pot.
Yeah, it really was. And he was engaging with the issues of the day, too. Discussions of corporations, fascist art and architecture, ethics. And then, of course, there's his 1931 study of alchemy, La Tradizione Hermetica. That was a big deal.
Alchemy.
Yeah. This book was highly acclaimed. Jung praised it, Mircea Eliade, Marguerite Yourcenar. They all considered it a definitive work on the subject.
Wow. So he's recognized as a serious scholar in this field.
Absolutely. Gottfried Benn called it an epical book, a book that changes the reader. And Eliade, he described Evola as one of the most interesting spirits of the war generation, with this truly astounding knowledge.
It's clear his interest went far beyond, just the political.
Way beyond. He was a polymath, a true Renaissance man in a lot of ways.
Okay, let's get back to his post-war disillusionment with fascism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was pretty profound, right?
Oh, yeah. Evola's attitude towards fascism, it really went through these phases. It started with hope, then moved to this more sober realization, but still with the possibility of, pushing for traditionalist reforms. But then he recognizes its ultimate failure, and then there's a sense of loyalty to those who fought on that side. But ultimately, it ends in apolitia.
Apolitia, what does that mean?
It's this total withdrawal from political engagement, a complete disillusionment with worldly affairs.
So like giving up on politics altogether.
Yeah. And remember, his main criticism, the one that underlies all the others, is that fascism lacked those genuine spiritual roots. All his other critiques about totalitarianism, the bureaucracy, populism, the focus on appearances, state education, pro-natalist policies, it all stemmed from that perceived spiritual void.
Okay, let's dive into another sensitive topic.
Yeah.
Evola's concept of race.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's important to acknowledge up front that this is an area where his ideas have been misinterpreted, misused, and often taken out of context.
Right. It's really crucial to understand that Evola's understanding of race is rooted in this traditional view of the human being, spirit, soul, and body.
Right, a tripartite view.
Exactly. And this is very different from just the purely biological or anthropological view of race that, we tend to think of today. For Evola, race wasn't just physical, it was also in the soul, in the spirit. It was this deep, almost metaphysical force that manifested across these different dimensions of being.
Okay, and Evola often directed his critiques, his attacks towards, quote, the Jews. But in his framework, what did that actually represent?
Well, he saw the Jews, as he put it, as a kind of symbol of economic materialism, of individualism, of the power of money. He considered his work to be a fight against materialism, and unfortunately, he used some of the prejudices and generalizations that were common in his time.
He even echoed accusations made by figures like Martin Luther and Karl Marx.
Yeah, it's really disturbing to read some of that stuff today, and some of his statements, especially those about the death of Cornelia Codreanu, are really troubling. They reflect the dangerous rhetoric of the time.
Right, and we need to be really clear here. We're in no way endorsing those views. We're simply trying to understand Evola's thinking within its historical context.
Exactly, and it's important to note that, Evola's newspaper articles, the ones written under deadline pressure, they tend to be much more forceful, more polemical than his books.
So maybe a difference in style and tone.
Maybe. But we also need to acknowledge the widespread anti-Semitism of that era. It was pervasive even among intellectuals who were otherwise critical of, mainstream society. It was part of the zeitgeist.
A very dark part of the zeitgeist.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've talked about Evola's apolitia, his withdrawal from political engagement, but he still encouraged action, right? How does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting tension. One interpretation offered by his critic Furio Jesi is that Evola, he came to see all worldly political action as ultimately futile.
So what's the point of action then?
Well, Jesi argues that Evola still believed that, wise individuals should encourage those who aren't, quote, initiates to engage in action. It's like a necessary learning process,
Yeah.
even if the wise themselves have moved beyond it through apolitia, through that withdrawal.
So action as a pedagogical tool almost.
Yeah, you could see it that way. A way to learn through experience, even if the ultimate goal is to transcend the need for it.
And despite this apparent disillusionment with politics, Evola never wavered on his core principles. Right?
No, never. He was uncompromising on that front. For him, these principles were eternal, not subject to negotiation or compromise. They came from a transcendent source, and that was it.
No room for debate.
Nope. And his motto really sums this up. Act without heeding the fruits, without letting the prospects of success or failure, victory or loss influence you, nor even joy or pain or the approval and rejection of others. It's about being whole, being true to yourself regardless of the outcome.
So how did Evola define some of his key terms like style and tradition? Because, they might not mean what we typically think they mean.
Right, right. So for Evola, style wasn't about fashion. It was about this deep loyalty to oneself, to an idea. It was about intensity, about refusing to compromise, and this total engagement that permeates your whole existence. And tradition, that's even more interesting, he defined it as that which is most revolutionary in the face of today's prevailing values. So it's not about, clinging to the past blindly. It's about upholding those timeless principles that are actually radical in the context of modern society.
Okay, and Evola frequently talks about the inner enemy, right? What do you mean by that?
He believed that the real battle wasn't just against, external forces like Bolshevism, Americanism, consumerism. It was against those forces within ourselves. He said that these external currents wouldn't have any power over us if we weren't already inner Bolshevists, Americans, consumers, He saw his esoteric work as this way to gain control over the inner realm, which then influences the outer world.
So change yourself and the world will follow.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And this aligns with what Ernst Jünger, another fascinating thinker, called the outward fight an existential moment, a deep inner experience. It's like a metaphor, right? The external battle reflects this internal spiritual conflict.
And Evola points out that a lot of intellectuals who at various points were sympathetic to fascism or National Socialism, they shared this insight about the importance of, that inner dimension. Guys like Gottfried Benn, Ed Hamsun, Ezra Pound, Ferdinand Celine.
Yeah. Even Luigi Pirandello, when he signed a manifesto of fascist intellectuals, he famously said, "I have always struggled against words."
So there's this sense of something deeper going on beneath the surface, right?
Yeah.
A dissatisfaction with the dominant modes of thought of expression.
Exactly. A struggle against the limitations of language itself, almost.
Okay, so what was Evola's main goal in writing Men Among the Ruins? What was he trying to achieve?
He was writing in the very specific context of, post-war Italy. The first edition came out in 1953. And it was basically a call for a realignment of the right. Not so much in a political sense, but more in this ideal spiritual sense.
So less about party politics, more about fundamental principles.
Exactly. He wanted to articulate a doctrine of the state, a set of values that could provide a real direction for this realignment. And the fact that the preface was written by Junio Valerio Borghese, this decorated military figure, that was very symbolic.
Yeah, it lent a certain weight, a certain authority to the book.
Yeah.
And it resonated, especially with young people at the time.
It did. And what's interesting is that, Borghese in his preface, he saw the book as this cry of protest, a protest against the moral and political decay of the post-war world. He's calling for a radical reconstruction of civic life.
So a very strong, very urgent call to action.
Yeah.
And Borghese really highlights some of Evola's key points, right? Like his defense of the organic, or what he calls the transcendent or anagogical character of the state.
Yeah. and how that contrasts with, both excessive individualism and the corruption of parliamentary systems, and also, of course, these formless, bureaucratic, and totalitarian regimes that were emerging.
Right, so a rejection of both extremes. And Borghese also emphasizes that Evola's focus on auctoritas, on authority and hierarchy, which he sees as essential for real justice and liberty.
And also his concept of tradition as these eternally valid principles that stand in opposition to this historicist myth of inevitable progress.
So timelessness versus progress, an interesting tension there.
Yeah, a recurring theme in Evola's work.
And what about Evola's critique of historicism? That's pretty central to his thinking, right?
It is. He saw this fundamental unbridgeable gap between, those traditional principles and the historicist thesis, which basically says that institutions and their reasons for existing, they just disappear with time. He identified two completely opposing ways of thinking: the truth upheld by the revolutionary conservative based on timeless principles, and the myth upheld by world subversion, which is this belief in inevitable historical progress.
So for Evola, you're either on one side or the other. There's no middle ground.
Not really. And he points out that for Italy specifically, because it lacked this strong, unbroken traditional political legacy, any appeal to tradition is going to be more of an ideal, something to strive for, rather than a direct reference to a continuous historical reality.
Okay, let's move on to Evola's understanding of true authority, of sovereignty. How does he define that?
He says that true authority, true power, it has to be rooted in a transcendent order, and there needs to be this unconditioned, this absolute point of decision-making at the very heart of the political organism. And he contrasts that with the legalistic view of sovereignty, what you find in a state of right. He sees that as a caput mortuum, like a lifeless remnant of something that's lost its vital force.
So the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, almost.
Yeah, you could say that. And he talks about this principle of princeps elegibus solutes, which means basically that the leader is not bound by the law.
Interesting. So above the law, in a sense.
Well, he connects this to the power to make those absolute decisions when necessary,
Yeah.
in exceptional circumstances beyond the existing legal framework. And he makes a point of saying that, dictatorship in its original Roman conception was a temporary thing. It was meant to restore the existing order, not to create something completely new or to establish a new political principle.
Okay, and Evola traces this decline, this degradation of the state idea, right? And he sees democracy and socialism as key players in this process.
Yeah. He sees this historical descent, right, from the imperium, from the divine right of kings, which was grounded in those traditional social orders, in aristocracy, defined by discipline and dignity, to the rise of the demos, the common people, and then these materialized masses that are characteristic of democracy and socialism.
So a shift from the few to the many, from the qualitative to the quantitative.
Yeah. And for Evola, both democracy and socialism are inherently anti-state. They represent this degradation and contamination of the political principle. It's a shift from the masculine to the feminine, from the spiritual to the material. And he links this external subversion to a corresponding involution within the individual, the triumph of those lower, more instinctual faculties.
So it's a mirroring, right? What's happening in society is also happening within the individual.
Exactly. And this goes back to ideas we see in Plato, in Aristotle, this correspondence between the internal and the external.
And Evola makes this interesting observation about the feminine symbolism that's often associated with, with the nation, with the fatherland.
Yeah, it's an intriguing point. He notices that country and nation, they're often personified as female figures, even in languages where the words themselves are